Do you think that the American diplomatic corps and the foreign policy class are way too obsessed with Europe?
Yes.
Why is that?
I think there's probably a few reasons, right? Like, one is, a lot of the folks who are leading our foreign policy today, they are either Cold Warriors right at the end of it, or they came of age professionally as we were winning it, right? A lot of the folks who are in very senior positions today were just really cutting their teeth in government in the 90s, right? When we had beaten the Soviet Union and sort of, there was this sort of euphoria and sense of end of history and all the rest. And that, my impression has been that was, and is based, largely on observation, also on many conversations, that's the formative experience. That's the framework, and by contrast, for me, my frame was a lot more informed, for example, by the failures of Iraq, right? And so, I think the, where you're coming from in the sense says a lot about, where you're going, right? If that is your sort of reference point and the framework that you sort of enter this all with, you're more likely to stay there.
Can you give us your, so I think of this in terms of physical analogies, sedimentary rock. So going back over the last 40 years, what are the slices that you see represented in the foreign policy professional class of people who came of age at different times?
Yeah, I see three main ones with a caveat. I'll do the caveat first. I had a great conversation. It was 11 p.m. with someone who was senior to me at CNAS back then. I don't know why I was in the office at that hour, but we were talking, and this person, I made the point about Iraq, and how that informed my skepticism about use of military force in the Middle East today. He says, well, actually, for me, it was Rwanda. It was this sense that this horrible thing was happening, and we could have done something about it, but we didn't. Right? He said that for me was really. What
year was Rwanda?
I want to say, oh gosh,
what decade?
90s.
90s. It was in the 90s. Yeah,
it was mid 90s.
Okay.
If I'm not mistaken.
You want to say 94?
That's what I was thinking, but I didn't want to say it.
Yeah, it's okay. They can fact check me.
Perfect. There you go. I'm with you on that. They'll fact check both of us. Which I thought was fascinating. Yeah. But I think in terms of sort of broad layers, I think of that sort of post-Cold War generation in the 90s. Then you've got a generation who really came of age at the height of the wars, the GWAT, right? Afghanistan, Iraq. And they display many of the same, I would suggest, dynamics, right? Mm-hmm. They are wedded to the Middle East, much as the transatlanticists of the 90s, and for that matter, parts of the 2000s, are wedded to Europe.
Because the people who made it into the foreign policy making class were people who were partisans of the war, not opponents of it.
Right. That's speaking of structural factors, right? There's that. There's the fact that if you came of age and were doing very, if you were a hard charge in the 90s, you're probably a Europe expert, right? Yeah. You're probably really deep on that, right? It makes sense. That's probably something you've sustained over time. Mm-hmm. It makes sense then that, even for pecuniary reasons, that's where you're inclined to, try and focus, right? Yeah. Ditto, if you were a 4-star general in the, in one of the wars in the Middle East, which is, obviously didn't go very well, but you probably have very strong opinions at that. And that's naturally where your mind goes. There's and then there's the personal side of it too. And I think it isn't completely understandable, right? That, you spend a considerable amount of time, you sacrifice, you've seen others sacrifice, maybe you've ordered others positions where they make sacrifices in these kinds of conflicts, and you want to sort of see that through, right? These things make sense, right? I think we can observe that and recognize these dynamics and the effects they can have. And, without belittling them, but acknowledging still that those effects matter, right? And then I think maybe just to, and to finish the question, that third sedimentary layer is, kind of the reaction, right? And I actually, I think we're still figuring out what exactly that means, right? I think everything we've sort of talked about today is reflective of what's happening in this layer, mm-hmm. right? There's clearly a reaction against the kinds of bad decisions that have occurred. That's playing out, mm-hmm. right? But it's still being sorted, right? And I think that's exciting. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. It's hard to imagine us ending up in a worse place than we've been in the past. But I think that's yet to be sort of finalized.
Interesting. So give me your lay of the land on the state of play with Ukraine right now. What do you think the basic summary of the strategic posture of the United States is right now, Ukraine, Russia, the different competing factions in Europe? And then after that, I'm going to ask you to predict what's going to happen. So,
excellent. I think the headlines Ukraine war is in a stalemate, but it's not really, right? Because if you think about the structure of this conflict, it's not both sides are not equally powerful, right? Russia has substantial material advantages, substantial industry advantages, manpower advantages, right? To the degree Ukraine is able to sort of match or more to the point, like mitigate those advantages, it's only with substantial foreign aid, right? So in a vacuum, we may be at a stalemate today in the battlefield, and Ukraine should be able to do, so long as it's on the defensive, do more with less. But this is a lopsided contest. So to the degree, and I, my personal opinion is that we do have an interest in Ukraine being able to defend itself and to deter Russia from attacking in the future, right? Like, I think that is important just as a matter of, preserving depth on NATO's eastern frontier. I think it's, a useful thing in general to end the cycle of conflict. That's been going on now for a decade. I think these are good things, right? But this is a case where the journey matters in some cases as much as the destination. How do you get there? Given the lopsided nature of the contest, you can get there ostensibly with the United States continuing to pour resources in, right? But, for reasons we've discussed and others, like, that's not a viable solution. It's not. Mostly because we have higher priorities and very limited resources with which to service all of them. So that puts us in a place where if you want Ukraine to be able to defend itself effectively and deter Russia, thereby bringing this war to a conclusion and ending the cycle of conflict, Europe has to provide the bulk of the military aid for it to do so. In terms of weapons, it's in terms of industrial support, so Ukraine can produce what it needs to a certain degree as well, right? And other things. This is kind of where we are in the conflict today. We are in this sort of transition. We are moving from a place where the U.S. has allowed Ukraine to contest, right, Russia's advantages, resulting in, an earlier successful counteroffensive. This counteroffensive was not successful, and now, an opportunity to be on the defensive and potentially hold the line, right? We are transitioning out of that phase, it seems, right? What comes next? We're not sure, right? If Europe steps up, you can imagine that, just by virtue of some of the production, Europe having to ramp up production to other things, right? Even if they do it with all urgency, you would imagine that, it'll be some time before Ukraine gets the weapons it needs from Europe to, mount another sustained counteroffensive, right? So you sort of factor that in. But if we move in that direction, Europe does move with urgency, you could expect a world where, some rocky shoals now, notwithstanding, you get to a place where now Ukraine can, in fact, get to those outcomes, right? If Europe does not, then I don't know. I think that's a world where you just look at the map, where Russia has substantial advantages. If Europe is not going to help Ukraine mitigate those, then folks can sort of do the math.
So Europe has enjoyed the ability to very affordably give facial support to Ukraine throughout this war because the United States was bearing the substantial supermajority of the cost. How deep do you think that strategic support actually is in Europe? Are there certain countries or forces on the continent that are more invested in it or less? If the rubber met the road, suppose it's very clear that no more Ukraine aid can pass in the United States, who would be the first to cave and say, let's wrap this up and move on to a new strategic status quo?
It's a good question, and I'm not sure. I think you're completely right. There's a diversity of views, right? Folks in Eastern Europe, the Balts, the Poles, like, they get it, right? They're right there. They have committed a lot of aid. They've committed a lot to their own defenses, and they're very much leading in that regard. You look past them, especially at Germany, France, others, especially Germany, and that very much becomes sort of the swing state, right? Where Germany goes matters a lot just by virtue of scale. It's hard to say. I will say this, though. It is entirely plausible to me that it becomes clear the U.S. is no longer going to provide all this, and you see this, like, general softening of positions, in Paris and Berlin and other spots, enough that like basically, okay, we're gonna acquiesce, right? And try to come to, you know, a quick resolution, you know, and take what we can get. The basic challenge there is that so long as the structural asymmetry I described earlier, so long as Russia wants all of Ukraine and has those lopsided advantages, then you should expect this cycle of conflict to continue, right? Because you'd have a ceasefire, you'd have both sides sort of consolidate, but Russia would be expected to consolidate more, right, and be more powerful on the back end of it, still have those sort of imperial ambitions, and then try again, and we're sort of back in the same cycle.
Whereas Ukraine immediately has to rebuild a country that barely exists
right,
anymore.
Exactly. And without, you know, the foreign military that would have allowed them to, you know, hold the line in the first place, they're going to have a hard time building the military required to do, right? Like you've sort of hit pause, but you haven't fundamentally changed the outcome, right? So even if European countries, thinking about Germany in particular, convince themselves that, okay, you know, we'll just roll over and that'll be the end of it. Like, you know, just from a realist's perspective, that seems unlikely to work, right? You may delay some of this. You may sort of put some time on the clock, but you're not materially changing the underlying factors to make war likely. They will have to deal with this again. Now, having said that, you know, there was a moment when it seemed like Berlin was going to do something differently. In the earliest part of the conflict, February 22, I recall, you know, the tone, you know, down to sort of the interpersonal dynamics, you know, of the Germans was very different. There was a sense of fear. There's a sense of recognition that, oh my gosh, something has changed and we have to do differently, right? This is when it looked like there was an expectation that the Russians would be able to take Kyiv quickly and that Ukraine would effectively cease to exist. And then Germany's Polish buffer would be on the front lines, right? They would no longer have Ukraine and, you know, Poland and the Balts, right, sort of shielding them. Like, no, you'd have, you know, Russian forces in Belarus and Ukraine, then Poland would be sort of the last line for Germany's at risk. And in that moment is when it seemed more than I'd ever seen before, heard before, that Germany was prepared to do the heavy lifting. But then, like we were saying before, you know, Captain America swooped in, and again, not to say that there aren't certain things that we, you know, rightly help the Ukrainians with, but overall the policy has served to reduce that sort of perception of threat and urgency and need on the part of Berlin. So all to say, you know, if things change in the battlefield in a way that convince Berlin their interests are in fact in real danger, you know, I can see them doing the right thing, but unfortunately it seems like it may take that kind of impetus for them to get there.
So do you think that Germany is more likely to stay hawkish on this conflict than France is?
I mean, if past is any indication, you would expect that. The question then becomes, well, how much, right? And how much more than just pure rhetoric? And I think that would be driven more than anything by, again, what's happening. What do they see happening in the battlefield, and what can they reasonably expect to happen by virtue of American policy, right? Like the ideal outcome is they are convinced one way or another that the U.S. will not be able to provide everything that it has. And as a result, unless they do more, then Ukraine will be at a significant military disadvantage. And then, you know, there's substantially increased risk that the Russians make advances, right? If Berlin's convinced of that, then ideally they change course at that time preemptively rather than waiting for that actually to happen.
This is a kind of a strange question. The world is kind of out of practice of doing armistices. It hasn't, and it certainly hasn't happened in very recent times, you know, in the social media age, in the democracy versus autocracy framework of foreign policy age. Do you think that, you know, a conventional both sides come to the table armistice agreement that is anything other than Ukraine gets everything that it wants and Russia gets nothing is even politically tenable in Western life? Like, would there be pressure on the Biden administration or the British or France and Germany to reject anything that seems to be giving Putin a win for this war? Are we just less capable in the West of being realistic about bringing these conflicts to an end?
Yeah. I mean, It's a great question. And I think it kind of gets to the heart of the matter, right? Similar to what we were talking before about hubris, right? Like this is in some ways a learning experience in a fundamental sense, right? You cannot have it all. War is a great teacher, right? Like, there will definitely be pressure, but there's also the reality that under no foreseeable conditions, the Ukrainians is going to get Crimea back militarily, right? That's hard, right? Now, does that mean Europeans or whomever has to agree in an armistice to formally acknowledge that, Russia owns it? I mean, these are things that diplomats will dispute at the table, but there are certain realities that have to be grappled with. And I think, as this goes on, it becomes harder and harder and harder to ignore those realities. And so, when there comes a time to negotiate a conclusion to this conflict, those will be the facts that Europeans have to deal with, and Americans too, whether they want to or not. And, you can find different ways to sort of, take the edge off some aspects of that in negotiations and the final framing and messaging and all the rest, the contents of whatever particular document. But so long as Russia maintains the ability to impose certain outcomes and we cannot change that at tolerable cost, then those are outcomes in large measure that we may just have to live with.
Break it down for us in terms of percentage likelihood outcome. What do you think is most likely to happen, least likely to happen to bring an end to this conflict?
I think the only way this conflict ends with anything like a Ukrainian state like folks want to see is if Europe steps up and takes the lead in providing Ukraine military aid. If Europe does this, then I think there's every reason to expect that you can expect Ukraine to mount a successful defense at some line, right? I mean, you'd have to pick a map and then talk through specifics, but to mount a successful defense, to hold off further Russian advances, to sort of stabilize the ground there and make clear to Moscow that they're just not going to be able to do better, right? With European military aid, that should be possible, right? And that is I think a relatively very good outcome. Right, that is an outcome where you've basically restored equilibrium, right? Where there's no longer this lopsided dynamic with an aggressive state who knows it can do better. You still have this aggressive state, but it can, right? This is a recipe for durable peace. This is what the Europeans can provide if they choose to do so. Absent that, it's hard to see that outcome. It's hard to see a path to that outcome. It's extremely difficult. Whether that means that Russia ultimately is able to take all of Ukraine, I mean, that's a hard thing to do, right? It's already been very expensive for them to take what they've had, no less hold it. But I think you'd have to conclude that absent that kind of change in posture from the Europeans, the Russians will be in a position to take more ground. And it will be harder for the Ukrainians to mount a conventional defense. And you may end up back in a scenario like what General Mark Milley was talking about prior to the war, and, uniquely sensible comments about, getting ready for things like an insurgency or like this, right? This is an outcome worth avoiding if we can. I think we can if the Europeans step up.
I've got a very serious question.
This is in many ways sort of the question, right? And if China waits that long, it'll have missed its window of opportunity.
Coolest battle of all time.
Why do you think the quality of your average 4-star general has eroded so much over the last couple decades?
Coolest general any country all time.
Why do we feel the need to pick a fight with Iran in the first place?